Yesterday morning, I inherited exactly $90 million from my late grandmother. Before I could process the shock and call my husband to share the news, her attorney looked me dead in the eye and handed me a manila folder. He told me, according to the Fulton County court system, I had been divorced for 32 days. I sat there in complete stunned silence for 3 full seconds. Then I calmly decided to destroy his entire life. Before I continue, please let me know exactly where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth. My name is Nia. I am 34 years old, and I run a high-end event planning company for the elite circles of Atlanta. My life changed in the mahogany-paneled office of Attorney Sterling in Buckhead. The room smelled of expensive leather and old paper. I sat in a heavy wingback chair preparing to hear the final wishes of my grandmother. She was a quiet, fiercely independent woman who lived in a modest suburban home on the south side of the city. I had always assumed her estate would consist of nothing more than that house, maybe a small savings account, and her collection of vintage jewelry. The elite circles of Atlanta looked down on me because I did not come from a wealthy legacy family. My husband Julian and his relatives never let me forget that I was just a working-class girl. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and opened a thick leather-bound ledger on his desk. He explained that my grandmother was not just a retired schoolteacher. She was a silent, incredibly shrewd real estate investor who had spent decades acquiring commercial properties in downtown Atlanta, long before the area gentrified. He handed me an estate summary. I stared at the numbers printed on the crisp white paper, my vision blurring slightly. The portfolio included 3 high-rise office buildings, a shopping plaza, and prime development lots. The total appraised value of the assets transferred solely into my name was $90 million. My breath hitched. $90 million defied comprehension. I had spent my entire adult life hustling for catering contracts, dealing with entitled clients, and swallowing insults from my in-laws about my lack of a corporate background. Now, I had just become one of the wealthiest Black women in Georgia. My first thought was not about buying a luxury yacht. My first thought was about my husband, Julian. Julian was the chief technology officer of a fast-growing software startup. For the past 2 years, our marriage had been freezing cold. He worked late nights and barely looked at me. I convinced myself the massive distance between us was entirely due to the financial stress of his company. His startup was burning through venture capital, and Julian was constantly on edge, snapping at me over the smallest inconveniences. His family especially, his arrogant sister Chloe and her investment banker husband Darren, always made sure to remind me that Julian was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, while I was just picking out floral arrangements for rich people. I sat in that heavy leather chair gripping the $90 million portfolio and felt a sudden wave of hope. This money changes absolutely everything, I thought to myself. I could pay off all his startup debts. I could relieve the massive burden he was carrying. We could finally be the connected couple we were when we first met on campus, before the pressure of Atlanta high society poisoned our marriage. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my phone. I wanted to call him right then and there. I desperately wanted to hear the relief in his voice. I truly wanted to save our failing marriage. As my thumb hovered directly over Julian's name on my contact list, Mr. Sterling held up his hand. His expression shifted from professional courtesy to something much darker, something that looked uncomfortably like pity. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a plain manila folder, sliding it slowly across the polished desk toward me. He asked me to put my phone down. He said there was a severe administrative complication regarding the transfer of the estate that we needed to address immediately. I frowned, setting my phone down. I asked him if there were outstanding taxes or hidden debts attached to the commercial properties that I needed to know about. Mr. Sterling shook his head slowly. He folded his hands together and looked me straight in the eyes. He said that to properly structure the $90 million trust, his team had to run a standard background check and pull my public financial records. He took a deep breath and told me that according to the Fulton County court system, my husband Julian had filed for an absentee divorce, and the judge had already finalized it. According to the state of Georgia, I had been legally divorced for 32 days. The air completely vanished from the room. A loud, high-pitched ringing started in my ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the city outside the window. I stared at the attorney, completely unable to process the horrific words he had just spoken. I told him that was absolutely impossible. I told him Julian and I had eaten dinner together just last night at our kitchen island. We slept in the same bed. His clothes were currently hanging in our master closet. He had kissed my cheek before leaving for his office this morning. There had to be a terrible clerical error in the system. Mr. Sterling did not argue with me. He simply opened the manila folder and turned the paperwork toward me. There it was. A final divorce decree officially stamped and certified by the county clerk. I read through the dense legal pages, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. The documents claimed that we had been physically separated for over a full year. They claimed that I had willfully waived my right to appear in court. They claimed that we had mutually agreed to walk away with only the assets currently held in our individual names. And on the very last page, right next to Julian's signature, was my signature. It was a flawless forgery. Every single loop, every slight curve of my handwriting had been replicated with chilling, calculated precision. Julian had forged my signature, committed perjury under oath, and legally divorced me behind my back, all while continuing to live in our house and sleep in our bed as if absolutely nothing had changed. I sat frozen in that chair, staring intensely at the fake signature on the legal document, and for 3 full seconds, the world simply stopped turning. I did not cry. I did not scream in anger. I did not ask the universe why this was happening to me. Because in that exact moment, every strange behavior, every late night at the office, every secret phone call over the past year clicked into perfect, horrifying clarity in my mind. Julian's tech startup was not failing at all. It was thriving. I remembered overhearing a hushed, secretive conversation he had with his brother-in-law Darren a month ago about a major technology acquisition. Julian was about to be bought out for millions of dollars. He had forged the divorce paperwork and rushed it through the court system to ensure that I would not be legally entitled to a single penny of his upcoming massive buyout. He wanted to secure his newfound wealth and completely discard me without giving me the chance to fight back. He genuinely thought he was a brilliant genius. He thought he had completely outsmarted his supposedly uneducated working-class party planner wife, treating our entire 10-year marriage like a disposable stepping stone. But as I looked from the forged divorce decree sitting on the polished desk to the massive $90 million commercial real estate portfolio, resting right next to it, a cold, dark, deeply calculated smile slowly spread across my face. Julian had forged a divorce to lock me out of his $12 million startup buyout. He was entirely unaware that by doing so, he had just legally locked himself out of my $90 million real estate empire. I looked up at Mr. Sterling. My voice was completely steady and entirely devoid of any visible emotion. I told him to formally seal all the inheritance files immediately and place every single financial asset into a highly secure, blind, and completely anonymous trust. The brutal war to systematically dismantle his life piece by piece had just begun. He wanted to play a ruthless game with my future. I was going to flip the entire board and burn his precious social status to the ground, ensuring he lost every single thing. The drive from Buckhead back to my Alpharetta mansion took 45 minutes. I spent every single second of that commute constructing an impenetrable emotional wall. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel as I mentally locked away the shock, the betrayal, and the sheer magnitude of the $90 million now attached to my name. I pulled into our long, winding driveway, staring at the sprawling brick estate I had helped furnish, decorate, and turn into a home. I expected to walk into the heavy, familiar silence of an empty house. Julian was supposed to be at his office, allegedly drowning in startup stress. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the foyer. Instead of silence, the sharp, metallic snap of a measuring tape echoed from the main living room. I walked quietly down the hallway and stopped at the arched entrance. Standing right in the middle of my custom-designed living space were my sister-in-law Chloe and her husband Darren. Chloe was pointing a laser measure at the far wall, a stack of high-end paint swatches resting on my glass coffee table. She wore a pristine tennis skirt and diamonds, the standard uniform for an Atlanta socialite who had never worked a hard day in her life. Darren stood beside her in his tailored investment banking suit, jotting down numbers on a clipboard as if he were inspecting a foreclosed property. They looked entirely too comfortable in my home. Neither of them had called. Neither of them had asked permission to enter. They had simply let themselves in with the spare key Julian had given them months ago. I stood there watching them, my mind rapidly processing the sheer audacity of the scene. They were measuring my house as if I had already been completely erased from it. Chloe finally turned around and noticed me standing in the archway. She did not flinch. She did not look embarrassed to be caught rearranging my living room. She simply lowered the laser measure and let out a long theatrical sigh, looking me up and down with that familiar mixture of pity and intense disdain she reserved exclusively for me. She adjusted her designer watch and offered a thin, insincere smile that did absolutely nothing to hide her malicious intent. I kept my face entirely blank, waiting for her to speak first. "You are home early," Chloe stated, her tone making it sound like my presence in my own house was a massive inconvenience. "Julian told us you had some minor brunch event to coordinate today. We decided to stop by and get a head start on the renovations he wants to do." I stepped into the room, my eyes sweeping over the paint swatches. I asked her what exactly they were renovating. Chloe gestured dismissively toward the sunroom I used to store my high-end table linens, premium centerpieces, and event portfolios. "Julian needs a proper home gym," she said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "He is an executive now, Nia. He needs executive-level wellness. He told us he wants to clear out all your little party planning inventory to make room for his new equipment. It is time to upgrade this space into something fitting for a man of his rising caliber." Darren chuckled, clicking his pen against his clipboard. He looked at me with a deeply arrogant smirk, the kind of smirk only a man who inherited his wealth could pull off. "Do not take it personally, Nia," Darren sneered. "Julian Company is moving into the big leagues. Your cute catering business was a fun hobby, but it takes up way too much room. You should probably start boxing up those table runners and fake flowers. Rent a cheap storage unit on the edge of town. It makes a lot more sense for your demographic." The disrespect was palpable, thick and suffocating in the air between us. They were not just insulting my career. They were actively treating me like a tenant whose lease had already expired. They spoke with the absolute certainty of people who knew a massive secret. In that exact moment, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Chloe and Darren knew. The entire family knew. They all knew Julian had forged my signature on a divorce decree 32 days ago. They were fully aware that Julian was about to receive a $12 million buyout, and they were actively helping him measure my house for his wealthy post-Nia bachelor lifestyle. They were standing in my living room, mocking my life work, giddy with the knowledge that Julian was planning to blindside me and throw me out onto the street with absolutely nothing. They viewed me as a temporary fixture, a working-class placeholder who had finally outlived her usefulness. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage burn hot in my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab Chloe by her expensive tennis skirt and throw her out the front door. I wanted to tell Darren that my cute catering business had actually funded the mortgage on this very house while Julian's startup was bleeding cash. But I did not. I suppressed the fire instantly, forcing the rage down into a cold, dark place inside my mind. I tapped into the exact same professional composure I used when dealing with the most difficult, demanding brides in Atlanta. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not give them the profound satisfaction of seeing me break down, and I absolutely did not mention the felony forgery or the $90 million empire I had just inherited. Letting them know I had discovered the divorce would ruin my entire strategy. I needed them blind to my newfound power. Instead, I smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm, perfectly detached smile that did not reach my eyes. I walked slowly toward the coffee table, picked up one of Chloe's expensive paint swatches, and examined it with casual interest, flipping the card over to read the absurdly pretentious color name. "You know, Chloe," I said smoothly, my voice completely steady. A home gym is a fantastic idea. Julian really does need to focus on his physical health. Stress can take a terrible toll on a man's heart, especially when he overexerts himself. Chloe and Darren exchanged a quick, uncertain glance. They had clearly expected me to throw a massive temper tantrum or dissolve into insecure tears about my business being pushed out. My absolute calmness unnerved them, disrupting the narrative they had rehearsed. I set the paint swatch back down on the glass table and looked Darren directly in the eye. "Just make sure you measure everything very carefully," I told him, keeping my tone light but laced with a subtle edge. "Major renovations require absolute precision. You would hate to tear down a wall only to realize the entire foundation is about to collapse right on top of you." Darren shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, and looking back down at his clipboard, his arrogant smirk instantly evaporating. Chloe crossed her arms, her smug demeanor faltering for just a fraction of a second as she tried to read my expression. I did not give them a chance to respond or recover their composure. I simply turned on my heel and walked gracefully out of the living room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I headed straight upstairs to the master suite, leaving them standing in confused silence in the center of the room. The realization cemented itself permanently in my mind. They were all complicit. They were all predators, and I was going to financially ruin every single one of them. At 11 o'clock that night, Julian finally came home. He played his part flawlessly, rubbing his tired eyes and sighing loudly to mimic the exhaustion of a dedicated startup founder. He walked into our bedroom, leaned down, and kissed my cheek with cold, unfeeling lips. He told me he was incredibly stressed that the company was demanding all his energy, and he just needed a long, hot shower to wash the grueling day away. I smiled softly and told him to take his time maintaining the facade of the supportive wife he believed he had easily discarded. As soon as the bathroom door clicked shut and the heavy sound of running water echoed through the master suite, I moved with lightning speed. I reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out his iPad. I knew his passcode. He had never bothered to change it, because he truly believed I was too oblivious to ever check up on him. I unlocked the screen, my heart beating with cold, methodical precision. I tapped into his private files, preparing to hunt for the final pieces of his treacherous puzzle. I needed the exact details of his upcoming buyout, and I was fully prepared to uncover whatever else he was hiding in the digital shadows. I bypassed his standard email applications and opened a secure document vault he used for corporate files. The password was the date he founded his company. He always was a raging narcissist. Inside, sitting right at the top of the directory, was a highly classified merger and acquisition agreement. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, rapidly extracting the concrete facts hidden within the dense paragraphs. The buyer was a massive Silicon Valley conglomerate. The acquisition target was Julian Software startup, and the final buyout price was a staggering $12 million. I stared at that number, letting the sheer magnitude of his betrayal wash over me. $12 million. He was about to become extraordinarily wealthy, and he had orchestrated an elaborate illegal divorce to ensure I would not be entitled to a single dime. The contract specified the exact timeline for the transition of power. The deal was scheduled to close, and the funds were set to be fully dispersed in exactly 3 weeks. 21 days. That was his entire timeline. He forged my signature on a divorce decree 32 days ago because the state of Georgia required a mandatory waiting period before a divorce could be finalized. He timed his felony perfectly, making sure he was legally a single man right before the $12 million wire transfer hit his private bank account. I scrolled further down the document, reading the specific clauses regarding executive compensation. Julian was receiving a massive payout up front, completely separate from the other founders. He had structured the deal to maximize his personal gain while leaving his early investors with mere scraps. It was classic Julian, greedy, short-sighted, and entirely focused on his own ego. The sheer arrogance of his plan was breathtaking. He actually thought he could seamlessly transition from a struggling startup founder to a multi-millionaire bachelor without me ever noticing the legal knife he had plunged into my back. He believed I would just pack up my event planning supplies and quietly leave the Alpharetta mansion the moment he handed me a fake eviction notice. I took screenshots of every single page of the acquisition agreement and sent them to a newly created, highly encrypted email address. He wanted to play a high-stakes financial game, but he had no idea he was playing against someone who just inherited a $90 million empire. The $12 million he was so desperately trying to protect was a tiny fraction of the wealth I now commanded. I kept digging through the document vault searching for any other financial discrepancies. I found a hidden ledger tracking his personal expenditures over the past year. He had been siphoning money from his own company, hiding the assets in offshore accounts to make his startup look less profitable during the divorce proceedings. The level of premeditation made my blood run cold. He had been planning to destroy my life for over a year. He had sat across from me at the dinner table smiling and complaining about his imaginary financial struggles while actively moving money to ensure I would be left completely destitute. The man I had married, the man I had supported through his lowest points, was nothing more than a calculating predator. I sent the ledger to my encrypted email. I now had the motive and the financial evidence. But I knew there had to be more. Men like Julian never committed felonies just for money. There was always another factor driving their ego. I closed the document vault and moved to his personal communication apps, ready to find the final, undeniable catalyst for his betrayal. I opened his personal email account and bypassed the primary inbox, navigating straight to his archived folders. I found a folder vaguely labeled as vendor invoices. I clicked it open and found a digital receipt from a luxury jeweler in Buckhead. The purchase was for a custom-designed, flawless-cut diamond engagement ring. The total cost was $45,000, paid in full via a private wire transfer just 2 weeks ago. Directly beneath the jewelry receipt was a forwarded confirmation from a luxury travel agency. It was a first-class flight itinerary and a 2-week reservation at a 5-star hotel in Paris, booked for the exact week after the $12 million startup acquisition was scheduled to close. The passenger details on the flight confirmation did not list my name. The second ticket was booked for a woman named Valerie. The name hit me like a physical strike. Valerie was not just a random woman. She was the youngest daughter of the primary venture capitalist who had funded Julian's startup in its early days. I had met her twice at corporate dinners. She was a pretentious, deeply entitled woman who loved to flaunt her family wealth. Julian had clearly decided to upgrade his social status by aligning himself with old money. He was not just divorcing me to keep his $12 million. He was discarding me to marry into the venture capital family, securing his position in the elite social hierarchy he had always craved. The sheer predictability of his betrayal was almost insulting. He had forged a federal document and risked serious prison time just to buy a $45,000 diamond ring for a spoiled heiress. He was planning to announce his new billionaire status and his shiny new engagement in Paris, while I was supposed to be weeping in a cheap apartment back in Atlanta. I stared at the receipt for the diamond ring, feeling absolutely nothing for the man washing his hair just a few feet away from me. I forwarded the ring receipt and the Paris itinerary to my encrypted email, ensuring I had a pristine digital copy of his infidelity. I quietly closed the email application, locked the iPad, and slipped it perfectly back into his leather briefcase exactly the way I had found it. The next morning, the Atlanta sun filtered brightly through the master bedroom windows. Julian woke up and immediately launched into his routine. He stretched dramatically, complaining loudly about a headache and the immense pressure of his corporate responsibilities. He walked into the walk-in closet, completely oblivious to the fact that I had dismantled his entire life on his iPad the night before. I stood by the kitchen island sipping my black coffee, watching him step into the kitchen wearing a perfectly tailored designer suit. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the marble counter, letting out a heavy, theatrical sigh. He told me he noticed the tension in the house yesterday. He said he knew Chloe and Darren had stopped by, and he apologized if they were being overbearing about the home gym renovations. He reached out and touched my hand, looking at me with those practiced, deceitful eyes. He told me to please be patient with him, claiming his startup stress was pushing him to the absolute breaking point, and that things would get better soon. I did not pull my hand away. I did not throw my hot coffee in his face or scream about Valerie and the $45,000 diamond ring. I played the role of the loyal, supportive wife to absolute perfection. I stepped closer to him, reached up and gently adjusted his silk tie. I looked directly into the eyes of a complete stranger, a man who had legally divorced me 32 days ago, and smoothed his lapel. I smiled warmly, my voice steady and sweet. I told him I completely understood his stress and that I knew he was working hard for our future. I patted his chest and wished him a wonderful day at the office. The moment Julian luxury sedan pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my purse and drove straight back to Buckhead. I walked into Attorney Sterling's office and placed my tablet on his desk, displaying the $12 million acquisition contract, the diamond ring receipt, and the Paris itinerary. I laid out the entire timeline with cold, clinical precision. Mr. Sterling reviewed the evidence, his professional demeanor hardening into absolute legal ruthlessness. We mapped out the immediate legal implications. By filing that fraudulent divorce decree 32 days ago, Julian had not just ended a marriage. He had committed a severe felony by forging a signature on a county court document and committing perjury under oath. But the most crucial detail was the timing. Because the fraudulent divorce was filed and stamped 32 days ago, Julian was legally a single man long before my grandmother passed away. He had intentionally severed all legal ties to me, meaning he had absolutely no marital claim, no community property rights, and no legal avenue to touch a single penny of the $90 million I had just inherited. I did not want him to just go to jail. I wanted him to lose his company, his social standing, and his future entirely. I instructed Mr. Sterling to initiate the immediate quiet transfer of my entire $90 million inheritance into an airtight, highly secure, and completely anonymous limited liability company. I wanted the funds buried behind layers of corporate privacy that no venture capitalist or investment banker could ever trace back to me. The trap was officially set. Julian was busy planning his $12 million celebration, completely unaware that his execution date had already been scheduled. The weekend arrived with the tradition of Sunday dinner at my mother-in-law estate in Buckhead. Joyce ran her household like a sovereign nation, demanding absolute compliance from anyone who entered her sphere. Her sprawling brick home was a shrine to Atlanta high society filled with photographs of charity galas, elite social club gatherings, and framed degrees from prestigious historically Black colleges. I was currently standing in her massive gourmet kitchen, basting a roast and monitoring 3 different side dishes. Despite Julian making a 6-figure salary and my own business generating substantial revenue, Joyce always insisted that I handle the cooking for these family gatherings. In her eyes, my event planning business was nothing more than glorified catering, which meant I belonged in the kitchen while the real professionals relaxed in the living room. Through the open French doors, I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and the sharp, arrogant laughter of my in-laws. Chloe and Darren were lounging on the custom white sofas, sipping imported wine while Julian entertained them with exaggerated stories about his startup. Joyce sat in her high-backed armchair, holding court like a queen. Their conversation deliberately carried into the kitchen laced with heavy elitism and thinly veiled insults aimed directly at me. Chloe loudly complained about how exhausted she was from attending an exclusive sorority luncheon, making sure to emphasize that the event was strictly for legacy members. She casually mentioned how unfortunate it was that some women simply lacked the pedigree to navigate elite social circles. Darren chuckled, adding a cruel remark about how some people were just born to serve while others were born to lead. They were talking about me, completely unaware that the woman basting their dinner could now buy their entire neighborhood with a single bank transfer. I maintained my perfect composure, adjusting the oven temperature with a steady hand. My $90 million secret was a warm, comforting shield against their toxic behavior. I arranged the roasted vegetables on a silver platter and carried the main course into the formal dining room, setting the heavy dishes on the long mahogany table. The family slowly migrated from the living room, taking their assigned seats with an air of immense entitlement. Julian offered me a quick, performative smile, playing the role of the appreciative husband for his mother. As everyone began serving themselves, my attention was immediately drawn to a massive, ostentatious gift basket resting prominently on the antique mahogany sideboard. It was a ridiculous display of wealth overflowing with imported beluga caviar, vintage French champagne, artisanal truffles, and a large crystal vase. It was the exact type of extravagant corporate gift designed purely to show off financial dominance. Joyce waited until everyone had a full plate before she deliberately steered the conversation toward the ridiculous basket. She placed her fork down and gestured toward the sideboard with a diamond-clad hand. She announced to the entire table that the gorgeous arrangement had been delivered that very morning. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly looking very interested in his mashed potatoes. Joyce proudly declared that the basket was a personal gift from Valerie, who she described as Julian's brilliant new corporate partner. The name hung in the air, heavy and loaded with unspoken meaning. I knew exactly who Valerie was. She was the venture capitalist's daughter, the woman receiving $45,000 diamond rings from my legally divorced husband. Joyce smiled brightly, her eyes locking onto mine with malicious intent. She praised Valerie's social background, ensuring everyone at the table knew that Valerie came from a powerful legacy family, with deep pockets and incredible influence in the Atlanta tech scene. Chloe chimed in immediately, enthusiastically agreeing that Valerie was an absolute breath of fresh air and a perfect match for Julian corporate ambitions. They were testing the waters, slowly integrating the mistress into the family narrative right in front of my face. Julian tried to intervene, offering a weak, nervous laugh and attempting to change the subject to sports, but Joyce was on a mission to humiliate me. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the fine linen tablecloth, and stared directly at me. Her expression was a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty. She told the table that a man on the rise requires a specific caliber of woman by his side. She listed off the requirements like a corporate job description, citing the need for extensive networking connections, impeccable breeding, and generational wealth. Then, with a voice dripping in sweet, calculated venom, she delivered her final blow. She looked me up and down, taking in my simple cooking apron and sensible shoes. She said that a woman with proper pedigree knows exactly how to elevate a man to the next level of high society. She smiled condescendingly and told me you could learn a lot from her, Nia. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Chloe hid a smirk behind her wine glass. Darren raised his eyebrows, clearly waiting to see if I would finally break down and cry. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to feel small, inadequate, and utterly replaceable. They expected the working-class girl to lower her head in shame and accept her position at the bottom of their toxic hierarchy. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I did not lower my head. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not cry. I was holding a heavy crystal pitcher of ice water, preparing to refill Julian's glass. I stopped moving entirely. I set the pitcher down on the table, the sharp clink of glass against wood cutting through the thick silence of the dining room. I stood up straight, smoothing my hands down the front of my apron, and met my mother-in-law gaze with absolute terrifying calm. I did not raise my voice, but the sudden drop in my tone commanded the attention of every single person in the room. I looked directly at Joyce, my face completely devoid of the hurt she so desperately wanted to see. I told her that I did not need to learn anything from a woman like Valerie. I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before delivering my response. I said that sometimes the cheapest things come wrapped in the most expensive packaging. The dining table went dead silent. The atmosphere shifted from arrogant amusement to absolute breathless shock. Chloe choked slightly on her wine, quickly setting her glass down. Darren's mouth fell open in genuine surprise. No one ever spoke back to Joyce in her own house, and certainly not with such surgical precision. My words were a direct, undeniable strike at the core of their elitist values. I was calling their precious venture capitalist heiress exactly what she was: cheap. The reaction from Julian was instantaneous and revealing. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. His eyes darted frantically between his mother and me, sheer panic radiating from his stiff posture. He was terrified. My calm, calculating response had just triggered a massive alarm in his head. He wondered if I knew the truth about the affair. He wondered if I had seen the jewelry receipts. He realized in that specific moment that I was not the oblivious, submissive wife he had spent the last year manipulating. I maintained my intense eye contact with Joyce for another moment, letting my words sink deep into her pride. Then with a serene smile, I picked up the crystal pitcher and smoothly filled Julian glass. Julian abruptly pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. He let out a nervous, forced laugh, telling his family that we needed to excuse ourselves for a quick moment. He grabbed my arm tightly, his fingers digging into my skin, and pulled me out of the dining room and into the dim, quiet hallway near the front door. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his composure. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded legal document. His hands were shaking slightly as he pushed the paperwork toward me. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, launching into a rehearsed, frantic lie. He claimed his tech startup was suddenly facing a massive, devastating intellectual property lawsuit. He told me the company assets were at risk, and he needed to protect me from the financial fallout. He insisted that I needed to sign this post-nuptial asset separation agreement immediately. He framed it as a desperate, heroic move to completely shield my event planning business from his corporate enemies. He begged me to trust him, completely unaware that I already knew it was a fraudulent document designed to legitimize his fake divorce. I stared at the papers in his shaking hands, calculating the trap I was about to construct. The document he was practically shoving into my chest was titled as a postnuptial asset separation agreement. But my eyes quickly scanned the dense legal formatting, immediately recognizing the standard boilerplate language of a final property division settlement. It was the exact type of document a divorce court required to finalize the distribution of marital assets. Julian needed my signature on this specific paper to validate the fraudulent divorce decree he had already pushed through the Fulton County system 32 days ago. He needed this piece of paper to legally shield his upcoming $12 million buyout while ensuring I walked away with absolutely nothing but my event planning inventory. Julian launched into a sickeningly desperate performance. He ran his hand over his face, letting out a ragged, trembling sigh that was meant to convey unbearable corporate pressure. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, intentionally letting a single manufactured tear brim at the corner of his eyelid. He told me the lawsuit his startup was facing was catastrophic and could completely wipe out everything we had built together. He grasped my shoulders, pulling me slightly closer in the dim hallway of his mother's house. He dropped his voice to an urgent, emotional whisper, claiming that the opposing lawyers were ruthless and would inevitably come after my catering business to settle his corporate debts. He told me he could not live with himself if his business failures destroyed my hard work. He begged me to sign the document right then and there to sever our financial liabilities, swearing it was the only way to protect me from total financial ruin. The sheer level of manipulation was breathtaking. He was weaponizing my love, my loyalty, and my fierce dedication to my own business to trick me into finalizing my own financial execution. He thought his fake tears and panicked breathing would short-circuit my logical brain, forcing me into a hasty, emotional decision. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for years, observing the desperate, sweating predator hiding just beneath his tailored suit. I did not argue. I did not question the bizarre urgency of signing a major legal document in a hallway during Sunday dinner. I simply nodded, letting my face soften into an expression of absolute trusting devotion. I reached out and gently took the gold-plated pen he was frantically offering me. I held the heavy document against the hallway wall, pretending to brace it for my signature. I knew exactly what I was doing. If I refused to sign, Julian would panic. He would realize his carefully orchestrated timeline was in jeopardy, and he might scramble to find another illegal loophole or delay his lucrative $12 million buyout. I needed him to remain completely arrogant, entirely comfortable, and utterly convinced that his master plan had worked flawlessly. He needed to believe he had won, so he would walk blindly into the federal trap I was laying for him. I pressed the pen to the signature line at the bottom of the page. I did not sign my actual legal name. Over the years, handling hundreds of vendor contracts and venue agreements, my signature had become a very specific legally binding combination of sharp angles and flowing loops. Now, staring at his fraudulent property division agreement, I deliberately altered the entire structure of my handwriting. I swapped my cursive for block lettering. I misspelled my own middle name, dropping a crucial letter, and slanted the last name in a direction I never used. To a casual observer in a dimly lit hallway, it looked like a quick, messy signature. To any court-appointed handwriting expert or forensic analyst, it would be instantly flagged as completely invalid and legally unenforceable. I was essentially giving him a worthless piece of paper. I handed the document back to him. Julian did not even bother to check the signature line or review the spelling. He was so blinded by his own massive ego and his desperate rush to secure his upcoming fortune that he simply folded the paper and shoved it deep into his suit jacket pocket. The physical relief that washed over his body was immediate and repulsive. His tense shoulders dropped, his breathing steadied, and a genuine triumphant smile broke through his fake anxiety. He pulled me into a tight, crushing hug, pressing his face into my shoulder. He whispered thank you, calling me the most supportive wife in the world. I stood perfectly still in his embrace, staring blankly over his shoulder at the expensive artwork hanging on his mother's wall. I patted his back slowly, feeling the exact moment my marriage officially died, replaced by a cold, calculating drive for absolute destruction. Early the next morning, long before Julian woke up for work, I drove my car to a highly secure federal building in downtown Atlanta. I bypassed the standard public entryways and headed straight for the private offices of the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. I was not there to speak with a random duty officer. I had a scheduled appointment with federal prosecutor Evelyn Hayes, a formidable, sharp-minded black woman who had been a fiercely loyal sorority sister to my late grandmother. When my grandmother passed, Evelyn had promised to always keep her doors open for me. I walked into her imposing office, bypassed the small talk, and placed the original certified copy of the forged divorce decree directly onto her desk. Evelyn adjusted her reading glasses and examined the document with the trained, cynical eye of a seasoned prosecutor. I explained the entire situation, outlining Julian's $12 million startup buyout, the mandatory waiting period for the divorce, the $45,000 diamond ring for the venture capitalist heiress, and the fake post-nuptial agreement he forced me to sign in a hallway. Evelyn listened in total silence, her posture rigid, her expression darkening with every detail I revealed. When I finished, she removed her glasses and looked at me with a fierce, protective intensity. She told me Julian had not just made a terrible marital mistake. He had walked straight into a federal nightmare. Evelyn broke down the exact legal reality of his actions. She explained that forging a signature on a county court document to defraud a spouse out of marital assets was a severe felony. Because he had used electronic court filing systems and email to transmit the fraudulent documents across county lines to expedite the process, he had also committed wire fraud. Furthermore, because he had sworn under oath that I had waived my rights, he was guilty of aggravated perjury. Evelyn assured me that this was no longer a simple civil dispute over a messy divorce. This was a clear-cut, easily provable case of white-collar criminal fraud. She told me to continue playing the role of the oblivious wife. She needed time to quietly build the federal indictment, subpoena his digital communications, and prepare the arrest warrants. She promised me that when the hammer finally dropped, it would shatter his entire world. Leaving the federal building, I felt an intense, icy clarity settling over my mind. My next stop was a private, highly discreet wealth management firm in Buckhead, where I met with the senior financial advisor recommended by Attorney Sterling. I sat across from him in a soundproof glass conference room, sipping sparkling water, while we reviewed the complex structure of my newly established anonymous limited liability company. The $90 million from my grandmother had been fully secured, sitting quietly in accounts that Julian and his arrogant family could never access. But I told my wealth manager that simply sending Julian to federal prison was no longer enough. The disrespect I had endured at that Sunday dinner, the years of Chloe and Darren mocking my business, the endless condescension from my mother-in-law, It all required a definitive response. I did not just want Julian locked in handcuffs. I wanted to completely dismantle the financial arrogance of his entire family. I wanted to systematically strip away the elite old money facade they used to terrorize people like me. I instructed my wealth manager to launch a quiet, highly aggressive financial investigation into my brother-in-law Darren and his supposedly successful investment banking firm. I also demanded a comprehensive full-scale audit of the commercial building where my mother-in-law Joyce currently rented space for her pretentious art gallery. I authorized my anonymous LLC to immediately begin silently purchasing their corporate debts, buying out their commercial leases, and acquiring the absolute financial leverage necessary to completely control their lives. I was no longer just a broken, silenced, betrayed wife. I was a $90 million apex predator, operating completely in the shadows, just waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike with absolute devastating force. The investigation into my brother-in-law Darren began the very next morning. I sat in the soundproof glass office of my newly appointed wealth manager, Mr. Caldwell, reviewing the extensive financial dossiers he had compiled overnight. Darren had always been the loudest voice at Sunday dinners, deliberately ensuring everyone knew exactly how successful his boutique investment banking firm supposedly was. He drove a customized imported sports car, wore suits tailored in Italy, and constantly bragged about his elite country club memberships. He was the golden son-in-law, the man who had elevated Chloe's social standing and constantly mocked my event planning business as trivial and insignificant. But the immaculate paperwork spread across the polished mahogany table told a completely different and utterly pathetic story. Darren was an absolute financial fraud. His prestigious investment firm was nothing more than a desperately fragile house of cards teetering on the edge of total collapse. Mr. Caldwell pointed to a series of highlighted spreadsheets detailing massive high-risk commercial loans Darren had taken out over the past 3 years. He had over-leveraged his entire firm to fund his lavish personal lifestyle and maintain the illusion of extraordinary wealth within Atlanta-exclusive social circles. He was drowning in millions of dollars of toxic leveraged debt. His firm was bleeding cash every single month, and he had been quietly taking out high-interest loans from secondary private lenders just to cover his basic operational costs and make the minimum payments on his primary corporate debt. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was almost poetic. The man who had stood in my living room just days ago, arrogantly telling me to pack up my cute catering inventory and rent a cheap storage unit on the edge of town, was completely broke. He did not own his luxury cars. He did not own his sprawling estate. He did not even own his own business. The banks and private creditors owned every single piece of his entire existence. He was a hollow shell of a man projecting an image of power while secretly suffocating under the weight of his own massive financial failures. He had weaponized his fake wealth to terrorize me and diminish my hard-earned success. I looked at the exact numbers on the ledger, memorizing the amount of toxic debt he carried. It was a substantial sum for an ordinary person, but to a woman who had just inherited a $90 million commercial real estate empire, it was practically pocket change. I leaned back in my leather chair, tapping my manicured fingernail against the edge of the glass table. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him. I felt an overwhelming surge of cold, calculated anticipation. Darren had built his identity on the illusion of absolute financial supremacy. He believed his fake status gave him the inherent right to step on people like me. The complete financial destruction of my arrogant brother-in-law became my new favorite business venture. I authorized my newly formed anonymous limited liability company to immediately execute a highly aggressive financial maneuver. Using a tiny fraction of my $90 million trust, I directed Mr. Caldwell to approach Darren's primary creditors and quietly purchase every single one of his outstanding corporate promissory notes. Because Darren's firm was categorized as a high-risk distressed asset, his private lenders were incredibly eager to offload the bad debt. They accepted the buyout offers without a single moment of hesitation. The complex legal transactions were executed with flawless corporate secrecy. The paperwork moved swiftly through the secure channels of Atlanta elite banking sector, leaving absolutely zero paper trail that could ever lead back to my name. Within 48 hours, the aggressive acquisition was officially completed. I stared at the certified legal documents resting on Mr. Caldwell's desk. My anonymous holding company now owned the entirety of Darren corporate debt. I had effectively purchased the man's entire professional future. If he missed a single payment, if he violated a single term of his strict financial covenants, I held the absolute legal right to instantly call in the massive debt and force his supposedly prestigious investment firm into immediate and voluntary bankruptcy. I was no longer just his working-class sister-in-law. I was his sole creditor, his financial executioner, and the absolute master of his ultimate fate. Darren was currently sitting in his corner office, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire professional existence now rested in the palm of my hand. He was likely drafting arrogant emails and planning his next luxury vacation, entirely unaware that he was walking on a tightrope I had just strung up for him. The sheer power dynamics had violently shifted in my favor. I could picture his smug, arrogant face from Sunday dinner, his cruel laughter as he mocked my catering business. He had looked down on me because I worked with my hands, because I served food to clients instead of pushing abstract numbers around a spreadsheet. He thought true wealth was about looking down on the people who built the very events he attended. He had absolutely no idea that true wealth was the silent, invisible ability to financially evaporate someone without ever raising your voice. I instructed Mr. Caldwell to hold the debt quietly for now. I did not want to trigger the financial collapse immediately. I wanted the destruction to be perfectly synchronized with the spectacular downfall of my husband. Darren needed to feel completely secure in his fake elite lifestyle right up until the exact moment the trap clamped shut around his ankles. The satisfaction of owning his debt was intoxicating, a quiet, lethal power that surged through my veins. He belonged to me now. Every arrogant comment he ever made, every dismissive glance he ever threw in my direction would be repaid in full. The trap was set perfectly. I smiled coldly, thanking Mr. Caldwell for his work before shifting focus to the next target. Next on my list of strategic destruction was Julian Mother Joyce. Joyce derived her entire sense of identity from a wildly pretentious high-end art gallery she operated in the heart of Buckhead. The gallery was not a genuinely profitable business venture. It was a heavily subsidized vanity project that operated at a massive loss every single quarter. Julian and Darren secretly funneled money into the gallery just to keep the doors open so Joyce could maintain her precious status among the elite older women of Atlanta society. The gallery served as her personal kingdom, her exclusive social headquarters, where she hosted lavish charity mixers and sipped champagne with legacy families. It gave her the necessary illusion of cultural importance and artistic superiority. She used that gallery to secure her invitations to the most exclusive galas in the city. It was the exact place where she had likely curated her relationship with Valerie, the venture capitalist heiress she so desperately wanted as a daughter-in-law. Joyce loved to use the gallery as a weapon against me, constantly implying that my event planning business lacked the refined cultural sophistication of her curated art exhibitions. She genuinely believed her imported sculptures and abstract paintings made her inherently superior to a woman who organized floral arrangements. She valued aesthetics over actual hard work, relying on the financial life support of her sons to fund her arrogant lifestyle. The gallery was the absolute center of her toxic pride, the very foundation of her inflated ego. I knew that destroying her social standing would hurt her far more than any direct confrontation ever could. I needed to rip the foundation of her pride right out from under her manicured feet. I turned to Mr. Caldwell and asked for her commercial property ownership legal records. The commercial building housing Joyce Gallery was owned by an aging real estate group eager to liquidate their physical assets. Using the immense purchasing power of my anonymous limited liability company, I submitted a massive all-cash offer that heavily exceeded their original asking price. The transaction moved with brutal corporate efficiency, completely bypassing the traditional lengthy mortgage approval processes. Within a matter of days, the title deeds were fully transferred and legally filed with the county clerk office. I stared at the certified documents confirming the final real estate acquisition. My anonymous holding company was now the absolute legal owner of this prime property. I was officially the direct landlord of the woman who had spent the last decade trying to humiliate me. Joyce was currently sitting inside that gallery sipping expensive wine and judging working-class people entirely unaware that the deed to the building was sitting right in my designer purse. She had constantly tried to kick me out of her elite social spaces, treating me like an unwanted guest in my own marriage. Now I held the absolute legal authority to terminate her commercial lease and evict her from the only place giving her true meaning. 2 nights after acquiring the deed to my mother-in-law commercial building, my professional life demanded my absolute focus. My agency had been contracted months ago to coordinate the annual Atlanta Botanical Conservancy Gala, one of the most exclusive and highly anticipated philanthropic events in the entire city. The guest list was a meticulously curated spreadsheet of old money families, powerful politicians, and the most influential venture capitalists in the Southeast. I stood on the mezzanine level wearing a sleek black designer pantsuit holding my clipboard and speaking softly into my earpiece to direct my catering and audiovisual teams. The ballroom below was a masterpiece of my own creation, featuring cascading floral arrangements, crystal lighting, and flawless tablescapes. I operated with absolute precision, ensuring every wealthy donor felt like royalty. Then the main doors opened, and the sheer audacity of my legally estranged husband walked right into my perfectly orchestrated event. Julian entered the grand ballroom wearing a custom velvet tuxedo, projecting the image of a wildly successful tech founder ready to conquer the world. But he was not alone. Walking arm in arm with him was Valerie. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown that clung to her figure, her hair styled in effortless cascading waves. Julian had the absolute nerve to attend an event he knew I was running and bring the venture capitalist heiress he was planning to marry. He was introducing her to the elite crowd as his senior corporate colleague, a transparent and insulting lie to anyone paying close attention. He spotted me on the mezzanine and offered a tight dismissive nod, signaling that I should remain in my place as the hired help while he networked with the billionaires. He firmly believed I was completely ignorant of his fraudulent divorce decree, his upcoming $12 million buyout, and the true identity of the woman clinging to his arm. He thought he was untouchable, flaunting his new life directly in my face. I watched them glide through the ballroom, stopping to laugh and clink champagne glasses with major investors. I did not flinch. I did not storm down the stairs to cause a public scene. I simply tapped my earpiece, instructed the lighting director to dim the chandeliers by 10% to create a more intimate atmosphere, and prepared myself for the inevitable face-to-face collision. Half an hour before the keynote speeches were scheduled to begin, I slipped away from the main floor to check the VIP powder room. As an elite event planner, ensuring pristine facilities is just part of the job. I walked through the gilded doors and found myself standing completely alone with Valerie. She was leaning close to the massive vanity mirror, applying a fresh coat of expensive crimson lipstick. When she saw my reflection appear behind hers, she did not look surprised or embarrassed. Instead, a cruel, highly calculated smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She knew exactly who I was. Julian had clearly shared his entire fabricated narrative with her, painting me as the oblivious, unsophisticated burden he was currently in the process of shedding. Valerie turned around slowly, making a deliberate, highly exaggerated gesture of brushing a stray hair behind her ear. The movement was entirely designed to flash her left hand directly in my line of sight. Sitting on her finger was the $45,000 custom diamond engagement ring I had found the receipt for on Julian's iPad. It sparkled violently under the vanity lights. She leaned against the marble counter, crossing her arms and looking me up and down with intense aristocratic disdain. She told me the floral arrangements in the ballroom were adequately charming, adding that it must be exhausting to serve people all night while they enjoyed the actual party. I maintained a blank, professional expression, stepping over to the adjacent sink to wash my hands. Valerie took my silence as a sign of weakness and decided to push the knife deeper. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. She told me that Julian's startup was about to enter a massive transitional phase and that a man with his rising trajectory needed to trim the dead weight. She smiled viciously and said Julian was finally taking out the trash before his big buyout, clearing space for a woman who actually belonged in his social bracket. She expected me to burst into tears. She wanted the working-class wife to crumble under the weight of her superior wealth and status. I calmly dried my hands with a linen towel, looking at her not with anger, but with the cold, detached fascination of someone observing a profoundly foolish insect flying directly into a web. I tossed the linen towel into the brass receptacle and turned fully toward Valerie. My voice remained completely steady, echoing smoothly off the marble walls of the powder room. I informed her that as the lead event coordinator, I needed to prepare her for her upcoming stage appearance. Valerie was scheduled to deliver a brief introductory speech on behalf of her father venture capital firm, officially presenting the charity keynote speaker to the audience. Her smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, clearly confused by my absolute refusal to engage in her petty dramatic high school bullying. She expected a screaming match, but I was offering her professional hospitality. I walked over to her, stepping directly into her personal space, and pulled a small wireless lapel microphone from my blazer pocket. I told her I needed to attach the device and test the audio frequency before she walked out into the ballroom. Valerie stiffened, visibly uncomfortable with my physical proximity, but her massive ego prevented her from backing away. She lifted her chin defiantly, allowing me to clip the small black microphone to the neckline of her emerald gown. I moved slowly, my hands performing the technical task with practiced mechanical precision. I threaded the thin wire over her shoulder, my face just inches from hers. I could smell the heavy, overpowering scent of her expensive designer perfume, mingling with the sudden tension in the room. I checked the battery pack, ensuring the audio feed was completely muted to the main ballroom speakers. Once I confirmed we were entirely off the record, I leaned in. My lips were practically brushing against her ear. The air in the room seemed to freeze completely as I dropped my event planner persona and let the apex predator take over. I kept my voice at a chilling, barely audible whisper, devoid of any anger or malice, delivering the words with the casual finality of a judge reading a sentence. I told her the $45,000 custom diamond ring on her finger was certainly beautiful. I paused, letting her realize that I knew the exact price tag of her secret engagement. Then I whispered the final devastating truth into her ear. I told her to keep the ring safe because she was going to need to pawn it very soon to pay for Julian federal legal defense fees. I explained that forging a spouse signature on a county court divorce decree to hide a $12 million buyout was a severe federal crime, and the United States Attorney Office was already preparing the arrest warrants. I stepped back slowly, making sure to smooth the expensive fabric of her gown where I had attached the microphone. I looked directly into her eyes, watching the absolute horror detonate behind her pupils. I smiled politely, picked up my clipboard, and told her she had exactly 3 minutes until her final stage cue. The transformation in Valerie was immediate and spectacular. All the arrogant old money superiority violently drained from her face, leaving behind nothing but raw, unadulterated panic. Her hands began to shake visibly, the massive diamond trembling under the harsh vanity lights. She tried to open her mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, or hurl another insult, but her throat simply stopped working. She realized in a terrifying flash of clarity that she had not aligned herself with a rising tech billionaire. She had unknowingly attached her family pristine reputation to a reckless broke felon who was about to be federally indicted for fraud. Her breathing turned shallow and erratic as the weight of the impending scandal crashed down on her shoulders. I did not wait for her to find her voice or attempt a pathetic defense. I turned around and walked gracefully out of the powder room, the heavy gilded doors swinging shut behind me. I stepped back onto the mezzanine level, looking down at the spectacular ballroom I had built. I tapped my earpiece, communicating with my audio-visual team in a crisp, authoritative tone. I instructed them to unmute the podium microphone and signal the orchestra to begin the transition music. The event was running perfectly on schedule. The morning before Julian's $12 million buyout celebration arrived with heavy rain washing over the Alpharetta mansion, I stood by the bay window in the master bedroom, holding a mug of black coffee, watching his luxury sedan pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. He had kissed my forehead before leaving, telling me he had a brutal day of final acquisitions paperwork ahead of him and would likely be home late. He practically vibrated with arrogant energy, completely convinced he was on the precipice of absolute financial victory. I waited exactly 10 minutes after his car vanished from sight before setting my coffee mug down on the nightstand. The time for playing the supportive, oblivious wife had officially expired. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and pulled down 4 large designer suitcases. I moved methodically, folding my clothes with the same crisp precision I used to fold luxury table linens for high-profile clients. I packed my shoes, my jewelry, and every single personal item I had accumulated over the past decade of my life. In this house, I did not shed a tear. I did not pause to reminisce over old photographs or linger on sentimental trinkets. The emotional detachment I had cultivated over the past month was absolute and impenetrable. Every item I placed into a suitcase was a heavy chain, severed, a toxic tie permanently cut. My phone buzzed on the vanity. It was a text message from the foreman of a high-end commercial moving company I had hired through my anonymous limited liability company 2 weeks ago. The message simply stated that his fleet of 3 massive moving trucks had just cleared the neighborhood security gate and were pulling up to the estate. I zipped the final suitcase closed and locked the clasps, listening to the heavy rumble of the diesel engines idling in my driveway. I took one last look around the master suite, noting the pristine bedding and the expensive area rugs. Julian believed he was coming home tonight to rest in his luxurious sanctuary before his big debut into the tech millionaire echelon. He had absolutely no idea his comfortable sanctuary was about to be entirely repossessed. I walked downstairs to unlock the front doors, my heart beating with steady, calculated rhythm. The complete and absolute dismantling of his entire physical world was about to begin. I slowly opened the double mahogany doors and ushered the moving crew inside. I handed the foreman a meticulously detailed manifest. This was not a standard residential move. I was not just taking my clothes and a few sentimental items. During the entire course of our marriage, Julian had insisted that all his income be funneled directly into funding his tech startup to maintain the illusion of Atlanta high society wealth. I had personally purchased every single piece of furniture, every high-end appliance, and every piece of expensive artwork, using the corporate accounts of my event planning company. Legally, Julian did not own a single item in the Alpharetta mansion. It all belonged to my business. Since Julian had already forged a divorce decree and legally separated our assets 32 days ago, he had absolutely no legal right to any corporate property owned by my company. I directed the crew to begin in the main living room. I watched with immense satisfaction as they disassembled the massive custom sectional sofa, wrapped the crystal chandeliers in protective foam, and carried out the antique side tables Chloe had admired just days prior. They unhooked the 80-inch smart television from the wall mount and rolled up the Persian rugs. We moved into the gourmet kitchen. The crew hauled out the oversized stainless steel smart refrigerator, the professional-grade espresso machine, and even the heavy bar stools surrounding the marble island. They emptied the formal dining room, carrying away the massive oak table and all 12 velvet chairs. I directed them upstairs to the master suite. They dismantled the custom king-sized bed frame, rolled up the premium mattress, and removed the matching mahogany dressers. I made sure they took the plush towels from the master bathroom and the silk curtains from the windows. The removal process took exactly 4 hours of brutal and calculated mechanical efficiency. When the heavy moving trucks finally pulled out of the driveway, walked slowly through the ground floor of the estate, the Alpharetta mansion looked like an abandoned, echoing warehouse. The sheer emptiness of the massive space was visually jarring. There was nowhere to sit, nowhere to sleep, and nowhere to store food. The hardwood floors were completely bare, reflecting the harsh, unfiltered light pouring in through the stripped windows Julian had wanted to clear out. My catering inventory to make room for his executive home gym. I had done him a massive favor by clearing out the entire house. He had treated me like a temporary disposable tenant, so I decided to leave him with the exact environment he deserved. The echoing silence in the cavernous, empty living room was the perfect physical manifestation of his hollow, fraudulent existence he had worked so hard to secure his $12 million, believing he could seamlessly transition into his new elite bachelor lifestyle. Now he would be coming home to a barren, empty shell. His grand illusion was completely dismantled, leaving only the cold reality behind. I walked over to the exact center of the kitchen, stopping directly at the massive bare marble island. It was the only permanent fixture left remaining in the entire room. I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out a single plain manila envelope. I placed it perfectly in the center of the cold marble surface, ensuring it would be the absolute first thing Julian saw when he walked through the front door. Inside the envelope, I had placed a meticulously prepared document. It was a photocopy of the estate transfer paperwork from Mr. Sterling's office, confirming my sole inheritance of my grandmother. $90 million commercial real estate empire. I had deliberately redacted specific account numbers and the names of my anonymous holding companies to fully protect my assets. However, I left the final appraised value completely visible in bold, undeniable print, $90 million, right beneath the staggering financial figure. I had highlighted the exact date of my grandmother passing. I knew Julian possessed just enough business acumen to instantly calculate the brutal legal mathematics of his situation. He would look at the date of the inheritance transfer and compare it to the date he illegally filed our fraudulent divorce decree. The crushing realization would hit him with the force of a freight train. He would understand that his desperate, felonious rush to protect his $12 million startup buyout had officially disqualified him from touching a single cent of a fortune nearly 8 times that size. I did not leave a handwritten letter. I did not leave a dramatic note explaining my departure or expressing my emotional pain. A woman with $90 million does not need to explain herself to a broke felon. The plain manila envelope was my absolute and ultimate entirely silent executioner. I walked out the front door, locking it securely behind me, and stepped smoothly into my waiting luxury transport. My driver navigated seamlessly through the heavy evening traffic, taking me directly to an exclusive 5-star hotel located in the wealthiest district of Buckhead. I checked into a massive penthouse suite that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. The space was immaculate, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, premium leather furnishings, and total privacy. I ordered a cold glass of expensive champagne from room service and settled into the plush sofa. My phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted video call. I accepted the secure connection, and the sharp, serious faces of Attorney Sterling and Federal Prosecutor Evelyn Hayes appeared on my screen. Spent the next 45 minutes conducting a meticulous review of our coordinated strike plan. Evelyn confirmed that the federal arrest warrants for felony forgery, wire fraud, and aggravated perjury had been officially signed by a judge that very afternoon. She assured me that a team of federal marshals were fully prepared to execute the dramatic takedown. Mr. Sterling verified that my anonymous, limited liability company was strictly impenetrable. He confirmed that the emergency federal injunction required to freeze Julian $12 million buyout funds would be executed at precisely 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, locking his bank accounts just hours before his victory celebration. Every single piece of the intricate trap had been flawlessly positioned. Julian was walking blindly into a highly coordinated ambush that would systematically annihilate his freedom, his finances, and his elite social standing. I thanked my legal team and ended the video call. I stood up, sipping my cold champagne, as I looked down at the illuminated city. Tomorrow night, The absolute and unforgiving hammer would finally and inevitably fall. The evening of the buyout celebration arrived with the kind of suffocating humidity that only Atlanta could produce. I stood in the concealed shadows of the audiovisual control booth, looking out over the grand ballroom of the St. Regis in Buckhead. Julian had spared absolutely no expense utilizing the last of his company operational budget to throw a party that screamed old money. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. The room was absolutely packed with the most influential tech investors in the Southeast, local politicians seeking campaign donations, and the elite Atlanta socialites who governed the city unspoken hierarchy. At the absolute center of this pretentious gathering was my legally estranged husband. Julian was holding court near the main stage, an expensive glass of scotch in one hand, and Valerie tightly secured on his other arm. She was wearing a silver sequined dress that caught the light with every movement, proudly flashing the $45,000 diamond ring I had practically warned her to pawn just a few nights ago. Julian was beaming, his chest puffed out with the arrogant pride of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world. He was slapping the backs of venture capitalists, accepting their congratulations for the $12 million acquisition as if he were a modern financial genius. Directly across the ballroom, I spotted my former in-laws. Joyce. My mother-in-law was swishing her champagne and laughing loudly with a group of legacy families, her chest puffed out with borrowed pride. Darren and Chloe were nearby networking frantically, desperately trying to associate Darren's failing investment firm with Julian's sudden windfall. They all looked incredibly smug, completely convinced they had finally shed their working-class problem and permanently secured their spot in the upper echelon of society. They thought I was currently sitting on the floor of my empty Alpharetta mansion, weeping over my ruined marriage and shattered catering business. They genuinely believed my entire existence had been utterly destroyed by their collective brilliance. The sheer volume of their collective delusion was almost intoxicating to witness from above. I checked my designer watch. It was exactly 8 o'clock. The federal injunction had already quietly frozen Julian bank accounts 4 hours ago. The trap was locked. It was time for me to make my grand entrance and officially begin the execution. I stepped out of the concealed control booth and walked toward the grand sweeping staircase that led directly down to the main ballroom floor. I was not wearing my standard black event planner uniform. I had specifically commissioned a custom power red silk gown that draped flawlessly across my figure, featuring a dramatic plunging neckline and a high slit that demanded absolute attention. I paired it with diamond drop earrings I had purchased myself that morning, and a pair of towering Christian Louboutin heels with their signature crimson soles. I did not look like a discarded, heartbroken wife. I looked like absolute royalty. I reached the top of the marble staircase and paused for a fraction of a second, letting the ambient lighting catch the vibrant red silk of my dress. I began my descent, my heels clicking sharply against the polished stone steps. The rhythmic, commanding sound immediately drew the attention of the guests standing near the staircase. As they turned to look, their conversations abruptly died. The silence rippled outward like a shock wave spreading through water. Within 30 seconds, the loud, booming chatter of the entire ballroom faded into a tense, suffocating hush. Hundreds of Atlanta's most elite residents stopped sipping their champagne and turned to stare at the woman descending the stairs. Julian was mid-laugh when he noticed the sudden quiet. He turned around, his scotch glass freezing halfway to his mouth. When his eyes locked onto mine, the smug, victorious color violently drained from his face. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave. His mind visibly scrambled, desperately trying to comprehend why I was standing there looking like a billionaire instead of breaking down in our empty house. Valerie grabbed his arm, her silver dress suddenly looking cheap compared to the absolute fire I was projecting. I reached the bottom of the stairs and glided effortlessly into the crowd. The wealthy investors and socialites instinctively parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, clear path for me to walk through. I did not break my stride. I did not lower my gaze. I owned every single square inch of that room, radiating a dark, lethal confidence that made the surrounding billionaires suddenly feel incredibly small and insignificant. As I moved gracefully past the ice sculptures and champagne towers, Chloe broke away from her husband and intercepted me. She blocked my path, her face twisted into a mask of absolute outrage and desperate panic. Her carefully constructed socialite facade was cracking under the pressure of my unexpected arrival. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging sharply into my skin, and tried to aggressively pull me toward the service hallway to hide me from the elite crowd. I stopped moving instantly. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, my expression completely void of any emotion. I did not say a single word, but the lethal intensity in my eyes conveyed a silent, terrifying warning. Chloe immediately released her grip, taking a hesitant step back. But her arrogant entitlement quickly returned. She stepped into my personal space, lowering her voice into a harsh, venomous hiss meant only for my ears. She demanded to know what on earth I was doing crashing this highly exclusive event. She told me my presence here was an absolute embarrassment to the entire family, and that I was ruining Julian's most important night. She leaned in closer, her expensive perfume suffocating the air between us, and fired what she believed was her ultimate devastating weapon. She told me Julian was officially announcing his engagement to Valerie tonight on the main stage. She sneered, telling me that the paperwork was already handled. The ring was already on Valerie's finger, and my time playing pretend in their elite family was permanently over. Chloe crossed her arms, looking me up and down with intense disgust, and told me to have a tiny shred of remaining dignity, turn around and walk out the front doors before security threw me out. She promised me that if I made a public scene, Julian would ensure my cute catering business was blacklisted from every single corporate venue in the entire state of Georgia. She was practically vibrating with toxic excitement, completely convinced she was delivering the final crushing blow to my self-esteem. She genuinely believed her cruel words would break my spirit, expecting me to turn around and run away in shame. She had absolutely no idea that her petty threats were nothing more than background noise to the absolute catastrophe I was about to unleash on her entire existence. I did not blink. I simply reached out to a passing waiter, picked up a crystal flute of vintage champagne from his silver tray, and took a slow, deliberate, satisfying sip. I let the expensive bubbles coat my tongue, savoring the absolute absurdity of her childish threats, while she stood there fuming. I looked Chloe directly in the eyes, maintaining a serene, chilling smile that made her visibly flinch. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring the rich acoustics of my tone carried just enough weight to terrify her. I told her I possessed a massive abundance of dignity. I explained that I was not here to cry, cause a dramatic scene, or beg for my deceitful husband back. I told her I was here in my official professional capacity. I took another slow sip of champagne, letting the tense silence stretch just long enough to make her heart race with uncertainty. I smiled warmly and told her I was just here to ensure the audiovisual presentation on the main stage ran perfectly smoothly for Julian's big announcement. Chloe stared at me, sheer confusion completely masking her arrogant features. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand a real explanation, but I did not give her the opportunity to utter another syllable. I smoothly bypassed her, leaving her standing frozen and utterly speechless in the middle of the crowded ballroom. I continued my deliberate, powerful walk directly toward the front of the room, my eyes locked securely on the massive projection screen hanging behind the main stage. Julian was sweating profusely now, his eyes darting frantically toward the security guards stationed near the heavy oak exits. I took a commanding position right at the very edge of the VIP seating area, standing perfectly centered in Julian's direct line of sight. I raised my champagne flute slightly in his direction, offering him a silent, mocking toast. The house lights dimmed entirely, leaving only the dramatic spotlights illuminating the main stage. The grand orchestral music faded into a sophisticated pulsing beat as the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, his voice echoing across the cavernous ballroom. He announced the man of the hour, the visionary founder whose technological brilliance had just secured a $12 million acquisition. The applause was deafening. It rolled through the room like thunder as Julian strode confidently up the carpeted stairs and took his position behind the lucite podium. He adjusted his velvet lapels, soaking in the adoration of Atlanta's wealthiest investors. He leaned into the microphone, flashing that perfectly practiced, arrogant smile that I knew so intimately. He began his speech by thanking the venture capitalists who had believed in his dream from the very beginning. He spoke at length about the grueling hours, the relentless dedication, and the immense sacrifices required to build a tech empire from nothing. He paced the stage like a seasoned politician, gesturing expansively with his hands. He transitioned smoothly into a deeply manipulative narrative about overcoming immense personal obstacles. He claimed that the road to success was often paved with difficult choices and painful sacrifices. He looked out at the sea of elite faces and spoke about having to shed the anchors of his past to ensure his company could reach its ultimate potential. He framed his ruthless ambition as heroic dedication. He talked about how a man must constantly evolve, leaving behind the things that no longer serve his highest calling. It was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. He was standing in front of billionaires, actively spinning his felony forgery and marital betrayal into a triumphant story of personal growth. He spoke about his brilliant future, declaring that tonight marked the absolute beginning of his greatest chapter yet. He praised his family for their unwavering support, making eye contact with his mother Joyce and his sister Chloe, who were clapping enthusiastically from the front row. He called them his rock during the turbulent times of building his startup. The sheer hypocrisy of his words tasted bitter, but I simply watched him perform. He promised the investors in the room that this $12 million buyout was merely the launchpad for his next billion-dollar venture. He commanded the room with absolute authority, entirely unaware that the woman he had just labeled a personal obstacle was standing just a few feet away, holding the detonator to his entire life. Julian let the applause wash over him one more time before lowering his hand to quiet the room. His voice took on a sudden theatrical softness, a tone designed to convey deep emotional sincerity. He told the audience that while building a company requires immense personal strength, no successful man ever reaches the summit entirely alone. He claimed he had recently found a true partner, someone who understood the unique pressures of the executive world and matched his ambitious vision for the future. He turned his attention to the front table where Valerie sat, her emerald green dress glittering under the stage lights. He extended his hand toward her and spoke her name into the microphone, officially inviting her to join him on the stage. The crowd murmured with polite, intrigued approval as Valerie stood up. She walked up the stairs with practiced elegance, projecting the image of the perfect old money heiress. She took her place right beside him, beaming with pride, entirely hiding the absolute terror I had instilled in her just 30 minutes ago in the powder room. Julian slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. He proudly announced to the entire ballroom that Valerie was not just a crucial corporate colleague who had helped facilitate this massive acquisition, but the woman he had chosen to share his new $12 million chapter with. He signaled to a waiter who promptly stepped onto the stage carrying 2 crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne. Julian handed one to Valerie and raised his own glass high above his head. He declared that tonight was a celebration of new beginnings, limitless wealth, and the power of finding a partner who truly belongs in your world. The crowd raised their glasses in unison, ready to toast to his monumental success and his shiny new engagement. He smiled down at Valerie, ensuring the massive $45,000 diamond ring on her finger caught the harsh glare of the stage lights for every investor to see. Chloe and Darren cheered the loudest from the front row, desperate to cement their association with Valerie's wealthy venture capitalist family. Julian shouted a final triumphant cheer into the microphone, declaring that the future belonged to them. He looked happier and more victorious than I had ever seen him in our entire 10-year relationship. He believed he had achieved total victory. He believed he had seamlessly discarded me and secured his fortune without a single consequence. As the ballroom erupted into cheers, I turned my back on the stage and walked swiftly toward the hidden audiovisual control booth tucked behind the heavy velvet curtains on the mezzanine level. My event team had already been briefed on my precise instructions. I stepped into the dark monitor-filled room. The lead technician, a loyal contractor I had employed for over 7 years, immediately stepped aside and offered me the primary control seat. I sat down in front of the massive digital soundboard and the master projection laptop. On the giant screen behind Julian, the sleek, glowing logo of his startup was rotating in a continuous, triumphant loop. I placed my hands on the keyboard and opened the secure file I had uploaded earlier that afternoon. I did not hesitate. I did not second-guess my decision. I hit the override command. The vibrant startup logo on the massive screen instantly vanished. The sudden change in lighting caught the immediate attention of the attendees standing near the back of the room. A split second later, a highly magnified, incredibly sharp, high-definition image illuminated the entire ballroom. It was the fraudulent divorce decree. The document was blown up to 30 feet wide, rendering every single legal paragraph, every official county seal, and every forged signature unmistakably legible to everyone in the room. The harsh, stark white of the legal document cast a blinding glare over Julian and Valerie. Right at the very top of the massive screen, the official stamp of the Fulton County Superior Court sat in bold, undeniable ink showing the exact date the document had been illegally filed 32 days ago. I moved my hand across the control board and zoomed in directly on the bottom of the document. The screen magnified the signature line displaying Julian Real signature right next to the sloppy, rushed forgery of my own name. I had highlighted the perjury clauses in bright, glowing yellow, ensuring that every venture capitalist, every lawyer, and every politician in the room could read the exact federal crimes he had committed. The image was undeniable. It was not a rumor. It was not a bitter accusation from a scorned wife. It was a certified, legally stamped government document, broadcast in high definition for the entire elite society of Atlanta to examine. I adjusted the contrast settings, ensuring the forged signature was razor sharp. I wanted every single investor who had trusted Julian with their money to see exactly how comfortably he could commit perjury. I wanted his mother Joyce to read the dates and realize her son was a criminal. I watched on the preview monitor as the devastating truth burned brightly over the crowd. I sat in the dark control booth, my hands resting calmly on the electronic dashboard, watching the absolute destruction of his carefully constructed reality unfold on the monitors. I had turned his $12 million victory party into a public exhibition of his felony fraud. The luxurious ballroom fell into a dead, suffocating hush. The transition was so abrupt, it felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. The cheerful clinking of crystal and the loud, arrogant laughter instantly evaporated, replaced by a tense, horrified silence. Hundreds of elite guests stared up at the massive projection screen, their eyes wide as they processed the magnitude of the legal document displayed before them. The venture capitalists who had just handed Julian $12 million froze, their expressions shifting from celebratory joy to absolute legal panic. Julian, still holding his champagne flute high in the air, noticed the sudden shift in the audience. He saw the horrified faces of his investors staring at the space directly above his head. He slowly lowered his arm, a look of profound confusion washing over his face. He turned around to face the projection screen. He looked up at the 30-foot-high image of his felony forgery. The color completely drained from his body. His hand went entirely limp. The crystal champagne glass slipped from his fingers, plummeting toward the stage. It hit the polished wood floor and shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces, the sharp, violent crash echoing like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. I stepped out of the dark control booth and began my descent toward the main floor. The ballroom remained trapped in a suffocating vacuum of silence. The only sound in the massive space was the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my crimson-soled heels striking the polished marble floor. I moved through the crowd with absolute purpose. The venture capitalists, the politicians, and the old money socialites parted instantly, clearing a wide path for me. They stared in bewildered fascination, their eyes darting between my stunning red silk gown and the massive 30-foot projection of the forged federal document glowing behind the stage. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my chin held high, projecting the cold, lethal authority of a woman who had just executed a flawless checkmate. I reached the base of the stage and walked up the carpeted steps without breaking my stride. Julian was completely paralyzed. His expensive tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a broken, terrified man. He was staring at the projection screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. He looked down at me as I approached his chest, heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He tried to take a step back, but his legs seemed glued to the floor. I walked directly into his personal space, radiating a quiet, terrifying calm. I reached out and smoothly pulled the microphone directly from his limp, shaking hand. He did not even try to resist. I turned to face the audience, letting my gaze sweep over the hundreds of elite guests making brief, deliberate eye contact with the venture capitalists seated at the front tables. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the grand ballroom, smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of anger. I looked over my shoulder at Julian and spoke directly to him, ensuring every single person in the room heard every word. I told him he divorced me exactly 32 days ago to protect his $12 million. I paused, letting the reality of his greed wash over the crowd. I smiled coldly and told him it was an absolutely brilliant strategic move, if only he had not forged my signature to do it. The gasps from the audience were immediate and audible. The word forged echoed like a gunshot in a room full of investment bankers and corporate lawyers. They instantly understood the massive legal implications. Julian's legs gave out slightly, forcing him to lean heavily against the lucite podium to keep from collapsing entirely. He knew he was trapped. He knew I had the exact evidence required to bury him. I turned my attention back to the crowd, my expression shifting into a mask of pure corporate ruthlessness. I was not just destroying a cheating husband, I was systematically dismantling a white-collar criminal in front of his entire professional network. I reached into the pocket of my red silk gown and pulled out a small wireless presentation remote. I did not look at Julian. I simply pressed the forward button. The massive projection screen behind us flickered for a fraction of a second. The forged divorce decree vanished instantly, replaced by a stark, terrifying new image. It was an official federal court injunction, bearing the unmistakable heavy black seal of the United States Attorney Office for the Northern District of Georgia. The legal text was highlighted in bright yellow, specifically detailing the immediate asset freeze of his tech startup. I raised the microphone again, my voice cutting through the stunned whispers of the ballroom. I addressed Julian directly, keeping my tone as professional and detached as a bank teller declining a fraudulent transaction. I told him that unfortunately for his grand master plan, committing a federal felony completely invalidates any corporate buyout agreement. I explained that forging a signature on a county court document and using electronic systems to expedite the fraud triggered automatic federal wire fraud and aggravated perjury charges. I looked at the lead venture capitalist sitting in the front row, the man who had planned to purchase Julian Company, and watched the color drain from his face as he realized he had almost bought a criminally implicated asset. I turned my icy gaze back to Julian. I informed him that his highly anticipated $12 million acquisition was officially dead. I told him his funds were forcefully frozen by the federal government at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon. His bank accounts were locked. His corporate assets were seized. His entire financial existence had been completely eradicated before he even put on his velvet tuxedo tonight. Julian gasped for air, clutching his chest as if he were having a physical heart attack. The reality of his absolute poverty was crushing him in real time. The investors in the room began pulling out their phones, frantically typing messages to their legal teams to immediately distance themselves from his toxic, fraudulent company. He was no longer a rising tech star. He was a radioactive financial liability. He tried to reach out toward me, his hands shaking violently, his eyes begging for a mercy I absolutely did not possess. I took a deliberate step back, refusing to let him touch the fabric of my dress. I clicked the presentation remote one final time. The federal injunction disappeared from the 30-foot screen, replaced by a simple, pristine banking document. It was a certified financial statement from a highly exclusive private wealth management firm in Buckhead. I had redacted the account numbers and routing details for security, but the bottom line was printed in massive, undeniable, bold black ink. $90 million. The collective sharp intake of breath from the Atlanta elite was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I looked down at the front row where my former in-laws were sitting. Joyce, Chloe, and Darren were staring at the screen with their mouths hanging wide open, their eyes bulging with a mixture of profound greed and absolute, soul-crushing devastation. They realized the working-class girl they had relentlessly mocked and degraded was currently standing in front of them as one of the wealthiest women in the entire state of Georgia. I lifted the microphone, delivering the final lethal strike with surgical precision. I looked down at Julian, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register that carried absolute finality. I told him the true ultimate tragedy of his entire master plan. I explained that by rushing to illegally divorce me last month just to protect his tiny startup buyout, he had triggered a spectacular legal consequence. I told him that by officially finalizing our divorce 32 days ago, he guaranteed he did not have a single, solitary legal claim to the $90 million I inherited from my grandmother last week. The mathematical brutality of his mistake washed over his face. He had risked federal prison to protect $12 million, and in his arrogant impatience, he had permanently locked himself out of a fortune nearly 8 times that size. If he had just waited, if he had simply been a decent husband for 1 more month, he would have been entitled to half of my empire. But his greed was his own executioner. He had built his own trap, locked the door, and handed me the only key. Joyce gripped the edge of her table, looking physically ill as she calculated the generational wealth her son had just thrown into an incinerator. Chloe covered her mouth, utterly humiliated. The empire was mine, entirely untouched by their toxic hands. The sheer psychological weight of his monumental failure finally broke him. Julian's legs gave way completely. He collapsed onto the hard stage, falling heavily to his knees right in front of me. He stared blankly at the polished floor, his breathing reduced to ragged, pathetic gasps. He had lost his marriage, his company, his $12 million, and a $90 million inheritance in less than 5 minutes. Standing just a few feet away, Valerie finally snapped out of her paralyzed state of shock. She looked at Julian kneeling on the floor, recognizing him not as a tech visionary, but as a broke, desperate felon who had just publicly humiliated her and her powerful venture capitalist family. Her face contorted with intense rage and profound disgust. She grabbed her left hand and violently ripped the $45,000 custom diamond engagement ring off her finger. She threw the heavy ring directly at Julian. It bounced harshly off his chest and clattered onto the stage. She did not say a single word to him. She turned around quickly, gathered the heavy silk skirt of her stunning emerald green designer gown, and sprinted frantically off the stage, desperately fleeing into the terrified crowd to escape the radioactive fallout of his utterly ruined life. Julian remained on the floor, a shattered monument to his own spectacular greed. Down in the front row, the ripple effect of my $90 million revelation was just beginning to claim its next casualty. Darren, the arrogant investment banker who had constantly mocked my catering business and treated me like the hired help, suddenly flinched. The custom-tailored suit jacket he wore could not conceal the violent, continuous vibration of his smartphone tucked safely inside his breast pocket. He ignored the harsh buzzing for a brief moment, far too paralyzed by the massive, highly classified federal document currently glowing intensely on the giant projection screen directly above us. But the phone kept vibrating with a relentless, frantic urgency that demanded his immediate attention. He pulled the expensive device from his pocket with visibly shaking hands, his terrified eyes tearing away from Julian public execution. The glowing screen was flooded with high-priority emergency alerts from his firm chief financial officer and his senior managing partners. He opened the primary email, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense financial text. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The message was a catastrophic legal notification from his primary institutional lenders. Every single piece of his highly toxic, over-leveraged corporate debt had been aggressively purchased earlier that week by a newly formed anonymous limited liability company. The urgent email clearly stated that this new majority stakeholder had just triggered an immediate, non-negotiable acceleration clause due to a minor previously ignored covenant breach. The anonymous holding company was legally demanding the immediate total repayment of millions of dollars in outstanding business loans. Darren knew instantly that his firm did not possess the liquid capital to cover even a fraction of that massive demand. His entire business was officially and irrevocably insolvent. He kept reading, his breath catching painfully in his throat as his eyes reached the very bottom of the legal notice. The parent organization attached to the anonymous debt buyer matched the exact corporate trust structure I had just proudly displayed on the 30-foot projection screen. The realization hit him with the crushing weight of a falling anvil. I was the anonymous holding company. The working-class event planner he had sneered at was now his sole creditor, and I had just deliberately forced his prestigious investment firm into immediate involuntary bankruptcy. Chloe grabbed his arm, her voice shrill and panicked as she asked him what was happening. Darren could not form a single coherent word. His luxurious estate, his imported sports cars, and his elite country club memberships were entirely financed by the company I had just legally vaporized. He looked up from his glowing screen, his arrogant superiority completely extinguished, and met my gaze across the ballroom. I offered him a slow, chilling smile. He dropped his phone onto the linen-covered table, realizing he was entirely ruined. The absolute destruction of Darren's financial world was immediately overshadowed by a screeching, hysterical voice tearing through the silent ballroom. Joyce, my former mother-in-law, violently pushed her heavy banquet chair back and stormed directly toward the stage. Her carefully crafted facade of Atlanta high society elegance shattered completely, revealing the deeply toxic, highly insecure woman hiding underneath her expensive designer pearls. She pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the surrounding guests, as her face flushed with uncontrollable, unadulterated rage. She screamed that I was a deceitful, manipulative liar who had meticulously planned to sabotage her brilliant son on the most important night of his entire life. She yelled that I had deliberately humiliated their pristine family in front of the most powerful tech investors in the state, aggressively demanding that the venue security forcibly remove me from the stage immediately. Her shrill voice echoed harshly off the crystal chandeliers, but not a single security guard moved a muscle. The elite legacy families and wealthy socialites she had spent decades trying to impress were now staring at her with profound, unapologetic disgust. I did not back away. I stepped forward, firmly gripping the microphone, my voice slicing through her hysterical ranting with the cold, lethal precision of a surgeon. I commanded her to stop screaming and check her email. Joyce froze dead in her tracks, her hand hovering awkwardly in the air. I looked down at her, projecting absolute authority, and told her that her entire social identity was built on a foundation of borrowed money and pathetic vanity. I explained to the captivated audience that the pretentious art gallery she operated in Buckhead was completely bankrupt, solely kept alive by the very tech funds Julian had just lost. Then I delivered the fatal blow to her massive ego. I informed Joyce that earlier this week, my anonymous limited liability company had legally purchased the commercial building housing her precious gallery with a massive all-cash offer. I watched the arrogant defiance completely vanish from her eyes as the horrific truth set in. I told her that as the brand new owner of the property, I had exercised my absolute legal right to terminate her commercial lease effective immediately. The eviction notice was already sitting in her inbox, legally stamped and undeniably permanent. I leaned over the edge of the stage, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. I told her she had exactly 30 days to pack up her fake elite life box, up her imported sculptures, and permanently vacate my property. Joyce frantically dug into her designer purse, pulling out her smartphone with trembling hands. She opened her email application and saw the official legal eviction notice from the commercial property management firm. Her knees buckled slightly. The gallery was her entire kingdom, her sole source of leverage in Atlanta high society. Without it, she was absolutely nothing. She looked around the room, desperately seeking sympathy from her wealthy peers, but they all turned their faces away, completely ostracizing her in real time. Her social execution was absolute. Just as Joyce collapsed heavily into a nearby chair, weeping over her obliterated social standing, and Darren stood paralyzed by his catastrophic financial ruin, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding, violent crash. The sheer force of the sudden entrance drew the immediate attention of every single billionaire politician and socialite standing in the room. Marching straight through the entryway were two heavily armed United States federal marshals wearing tactical vests, flanked closely by several uniformed officers from the Atlanta Police Department. The authorities moved with swift, terrifying purpose. The sea of elite guests instinctively parted, pressing themselves tightly against the banquet tables to clear a wide, unobstructed path for the approaching officers. No one dared to speak a single word. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots striking the polished marble floor echoed ominously throughout the massive space, sealing the absolute finality of Julian's spectacular downfall. The stern federal agents did not even pause for a fraction of a second to acknowledge the wealthy, highly influential crowd gathering around them. They marched directly to the front of the ballroom, their stern eyes locked securely on the man kneeling on the stage. Julian remained paralyzed on the floor, his head bowed, his velvet tuxedo looking pathetic against the harsh reality of the flashing police radios. One of the federal marshals stepped heavily onto the carpeted stairs, his voice booming with undeniable legal authority. He called out Julian's full legal name, ordering him to stand up and keep his hands completely visible. Julian slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his entire body shaking violently as the officers surrounded him. The leading marshal pulled a set of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He looked Julian dead in the eye and officially stated that he was being placed under federal arrest. The officer voice echoed loudly through the microphone I still held, amplifying the devastating charges for the entire room to hear. He cited the exact felony statutes for aggravated perjury, wire fraud, and the malicious forgery of federal and county court documents. He instructed Julian to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Julian offered absolutely no resistance. He was a completely broken, defeated man. The sharp, harsh, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly shut around his wrists served as the definitive, undeniable, and permanent conclusion to his arrogant master plan. The marshal firmly gripped Julian's arm and began reading him his Miranda rights, the standard legal warnings sounding incredibly surreal in the middle of a $12 million corporate celebration. They marched him forcefully off the stage and back down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The investors who had previously praised his visionary genius now stared at him with profound contempt, watching a convicted white-collar criminal being hauled away to face federal prison. I stood perfectly still on the stage, the vibrant red silk of my designer gown catching the bright stage lights, watching the men who tried to destroy my life lose absolutely everything. I watched the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swing shut behind the federal marshals, taking the shattered remains of Julian's fraudulent existence with them. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers pulsed through the sheer curtains of the venue windows, painting the room in the harsh, undeniable colors of criminal justice. I did not shed a single tear for the man who had spent the last decade trying to make me feel small. I simply set the microphone down gently on the lucite podium. The sharp clack of the metal grill against the hard plastic was the only sound breaking the absolute stunned paralysis of the elite crowd. I turned my back on the stage, the heavy red silk of my custom designer gown sweeping elegantly across the polished wood floor. I began my descent down the main aisle, walking directly through the very center of Atlanta's high society. The sea of venture capitalists, politicians, and socialites parted instantly, clearing a wide, respectful path for me. They no longer looked at me as the working-class event planner who had somehow married into a rising tech fortune. They looked at me with profound, unadulterated awe and a healthy dose of pure terror. I had just demonstrated the terrifying capability to absolutely dismantle a man's entire personal and professional life with flawless, ruthless precision. I walked past the front tables where my former in-laws remained entirely frozen in their catastrophic ruin. Joyce was sobbing uncontrollably into her linen napkin, her face buried in her hands as the reality of her social eradication set in. Darren was staring blankly at his vibrating phone, his mind unable to process the immediate forceful liquidation of his heavily leveraged investment firm. Chloe sat beside him, shivering in her expensive cocktail dress, knowing her elite lifestyle had just violently expired. I did not offer them a single glance of pity or a parting word of advice. They had dug their own graves with their relentless arrogance, and I had simply provided the headstones. I kept my chin held high, my posture perfectly rigid, radiating the cold, untouchable authority of a $90 million apex predator. I reached the grand foyer of the hotel, the thick velvet carpets silencing the sharp clicks of my crimson-soled heels. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air of Buckhead. The humidity of the crowded ballroom instantly vanished, replaced by the refreshing clean breeze of absolute freedom. A sleek midnight black Maybach was waiting precisely at the curb, its engine idling smoothly in the dark. My private chauffeur immediately stepped out, opening the heavy rear door with a respectful nod. I glided effortlessly into the plush leather seat, crossing my legs and smoothing the vibrant silk of my gown. I did not look back at the hotel. I instructed my driver to take me home, leaving the toxic wreckage of Julian's family completely behind me. 3 months later, the spectacular implosion of Julian's life reached its absolute inescapable conclusion. The federal justice system moved with brutal mechanical efficiency, completely unbothered by his former status as a rising tech visionary. Because the digital paper trail I provided to the United States Attorney was flawlessly documented and undeniably conclusive, Julian's highly paid defense lawyers advised him to accept a comprehensive plea deal rather than face a humiliating public trial. He pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud, aggravated perjury, and the malicious forgery of county court documents. The judge showed zero leniency for a man who had attempted to manipulate the federal and state legal systems purely for personal financial gain. Julian was sentenced to 72 months in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his corporate titles, his luxury assets, and his freedom. The $12 million acquisition of his startup was permanently canceled. The venture capital funding evaporated, and his former investors aggressively sued him for gross corporate negligence. The radioactive fallout from his federal convictions systematically annihilated the rest of his arrogant family. Darren's boutique investment firm collapsed entirely within 2 weeks of my anonymous limited liability company calling in his massive toxic debts. The aggressive liquidation forced him into immediate Chapter 7 bankruptcy. His luxury imported sports cars were unceremoniously repossessed from his driveway in the middle of the afternoon, right in front of his wealthy neighbors. Without the illusion of his massive income to sustain their lavish lifestyle, Chloe was forced to desperately sell her collection of designer handbags and luxury watches just to cover their soaring legal fees. They were swiftly evicted from their sprawling estate and forced to relocate into a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment miles outside the affluent perimeter of the city. Chloe's elite social circles immediately blacklisted her, treating the disgraced couple like infectious diseases. Joyce suffered perhaps the most agonizing poetic downfall of them all. Exactly 30 days after the disastrous ballroom confrontation, the commercial property management firm, acting on behalf of my anonymous holding company, executed the legal eviction notice on her prestigious Buckhead art gallery. The local authorities arrived to physically supervise the removal of her imported sculptures and pretentious abstract paintings, leaving her standing on the sidewalk watching her entire kingdom get loaded into the back of a discount moving truck. Stripped of her gallery, her financial safety net, and her successful son Joyce became a total social pariah. The legacy families and elite older women she had spent decades desperately trying to impress entirely cut her off, refusing to answer her frantic phone calls or invite her to their charity luncheons. She had built her entire identity on a fragile foundation of borrowed wealth and toxic superiority. And when I pulled the financial rug out from under her, she had absolutely nothing left to fall back on. The harsh reality of their poverty was the exact consequence they had ruthlessly wished upon me. Now they were forced to live the nightmare they had meticulously planned for my future. I sat at the head of a massive, custom-built marble conference table inside the executive boardroom of my newly expanded corporate headquarters. The sprawling corner office occupied the entire top floor of one of the prime commercial high-rises I had inherited from my remarkable grandmother. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. The city stretched out below me, a sprawling metropolis of endless opportunity and formidable power. I was no longer just the working-class wife running a cute catering business from a crowded suburban garage. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar corporate empire that seamlessly integrated elite event planning with high-end commercial real estate development. My grandmother had spent her entire life quietly and intelligently accumulating wealth, refusing to let the arrogant elite of this city intimidate or diminish her absolute value. I had taken her incredible foundation and multiplied it, building an impenetrable fortress of financial and personal security. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat as I reflected on the brutal, transformative journey of the past few months. I had learned the most profound and valuable lesson of my entire existence. I realized that you must never, under any circumstances, allow anyone to diminish your inherent worth or dictate the boundaries of your absolute potential. Julian and his toxic family had spent a decade desperately trying to convince me that I was small, insignificant, and entirely disposable. They had weaponized their fake prestige and their hollow social status to keep me trapped in a cage of insecurity and doubt. But their relentless cruelty had simply sharpened my mind, forging me into a ruthless, calculating apex predator entirely capable of orchestrating their total destruction. I had learned the beautiful, satisfying truth that when you stand firmly in your own power and refuse to tolerate disrespect, you never even have to lower your voice. You simply set the boundaries, establish the absolute consequences, and gracefully step aside to let the trash completely take itself out. My lead corporate attorney knocked softly on the heavy glass door before stepping into the executive boardroom. He carried a thick leather portfolio containing the final certified documents for my next massive commercial acquisition. He set the paperwork down on the marble table, handing me a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I looked down at the immaculate, legally binding contract, ensuring every single clause was constructed with flawless, airtight precision. There were no hidden traps, no forged signatures, and no fraudulent agendas. It was a pure, honest, and entirely legitimate expansion of my growing corporate empire. I smiled a warm, genuine, and deeply peaceful smile. I gripped the heavy gold pen and smoothly signed my actual authentic name on the dotted line. The ink flowed perfectly onto the crisp white paper, sealing a future that belonged entirely to me. I was finally free, fiercely independent, and absolutely unstoppable.